It's one of those big, epic questions. Where did the Japanese people actually come from? It's a mystery that's fascinated people for ages. And today, we're going to find the answer. But not in some dusty old book. Nope. The clues are hidden inside of us, in our very own DNA.
Okay, let's bring this down to something we can all relate to. Have you ever just looked in the mirror and thought, wow, I have my mom's eyes, or I got my dad's nose? We all have, right? Well, that simple, everyday observation, that's actually the key. The science that explains that is the exact same science that lets us solve the huge mystery of where entire nations come from.
Right, because that family resemblance, it's not just some random coincidence. It's a message. It's a story, a biological story, passed down from parent to child, generation after generation, written in this incredible code called DNA. And here's the cool part. Scientists have learned how to read that story. And when we do, we can follow the trail all the way back, thousands and thousands of years into the past.
So how exactly do they follow this trail? Well, they've got these two amazing genetic tools in their toolkit. To trace your father's line, so your dad, his dad's dad, and so on, they look at the Y chromosome. And to trace your mother's line, they use something a little different. It's called mitochondrial DNA. Let's break down how these two things work, because it's actually pretty brilliant. Okay, the Y chromosome part is super straightforward. You might remember this from biology class. Women have two X chromosomes, right? XX. Men have an X and a Y. So for a baby to be a boy, he has to get that Y chromosome, and the only person who can give it to him is his dad. It's impossible for it to come from his mom. This means the Y chromosome gets passed down almost unchanged from father to son to grandson. It's like a genetic last name, a perfect unbroken signature tracing the paternal line all the way back through history. All right, so that's the dad's side covered. But what about the mom's side? For that, we have to look in a really interesting place. We're not looking at the main DNA in the center of the cell, the nucleus. Instead, we're zooming into these tiny little engines inside our cells, the things that create all our energy. They're called mitochondria. And guess what? They have their own separate DNA. We call it mtDNA, and how it gets passed down is super cool. So check this out. When a sperm and an egg meet, the sperm has one job: deliver the dad's main DNA package. To do that, it travels light. It has mitochondria to power its journey, but when it actually enters the egg, it basically ditches them at the door. So all of the mitochondria, those little power plants, that end up in the newly formed embryo, they all come from the mother's egg. Every single one. Which means that you, me, everybody, we all get our mitochondrial DNA exclusively from our moms. It's a perfect, unbroken maternal chain, just like the Y chromosome is for the paternal line.
Now, with these two tools, we can do something incredible. We can literally map the entire journey of humanity. Using mtDNA, we can trace every living person's maternal line back to one common female ancestor who lived in Africa about 200,000 years ago. They call her mitochondrial Eve. From there, we can watch our ancestors migrate out of Africa, and as they spread across the globe, tiny unique mutations happen in their DNA. These act like little markers, called haplogroups. Think of them as genetic postcards from a particular time and place. And one really important one, haplogroup D, popped up in Asia. And then, around 38,000 years ago, people carrying this marker made the journey to what we now call Japan.
So, who were these first arrivals? Well, they became the Jomon people, the original inhabitants of the Japanese islands. And they had a distinct look. They were generally more robust, with more rugged, deep-set facial features. But then, much later, a whole new group of people began to arrive from mainland Asia. These were the Aoi. They brought new technologies, like rice farming, and they had a different look, generally a more slender build and flatter facial features. Now, if you're a figure skating fan, this might help. Think of the powerful, stockier build of Shoma Uno. That's more of a classic Jomon look. Then picture the very slender, graceful frame of Yuzuru Fanyu. That's more typical of the Aoi. Two distinct groups. Okay, so you have these two groups, the Jomon and the Yayoi. The big question is, what happened when they met? And this is where the genetic detective work gets really exciting. Let's look at the maternal line first, using that haplogroup D marker we talked about. Scientists looked at ancient remains and found that about 20% of the Jomon people had it. Then they looked at the incoming Yayoi, and they had a much higher frequency, around 50%. So the big question is, what about modern Japanese people? Where do they land? Bam! Right in the middle. About 40%.
Now just think about that for a second. It's like mixing paint.
If the Yayoi had just come in and completely replaced the Jomon, then modern Japanese DNA should look almost exactly like Yayoi DNA, right? That number should be close to 50%. But it's not. It's smack dab in the middle, and that tells us something absolutely crucial. These two groups didn't replace each other, they mixed. And what's really interesting is that this mixing wasn't perfectly even across the country. That ancient Jomon DNA signature is actually strongest in certain pockets today. You find it at the geographical extremes, way up north in Tohoku and Hokkaido, which is home to the indigenous Ainu people, and all the way down south in Okinawa. You also see it more in isolated mountainous regions. And, this is my favorite part, it's also concentrated in the Izumo region, which is like the mythical heartland of Japan, where all the old gods are from. Super fascinating.
So we know they mixed. The maternal DNA is pretty clear on that. But how did they mix? Was it a peaceful process of two cultures slowly blending together? Or was it something more violent? A conquest where the invading men defeated the local men and took the women? The maternal DNA can't really tell us that. To get the answer to that question, we have to look at the men's side of the story. We have to look at the Y chromosome.
And here's why the Y chromosome is so important for this kind of question. It's because, historically speaking, warfare has almost always been a male affair. And when one group conquers another, what you often see in the genetic record is that the paternal lines, the Y chromosomes of the conquered group, get wiped out or at least massively reduced. The conqueror's Y chromosomes then become dominant. It's a brutal, but very clear genetic fingerprint of conquest. So what does this fingerprint look like in Japan?
Okay, this right here, this is the smoking gun. The evidence is just wow. When scientists looked at the paternal lines, they found that Japan has a really high percentage of the Y chromosome signature that belongs to the ancient Jomon people. It's still incredibly common today. Now compare that to Korea or northern China. Over there, it's all mainland paternal DNA. The ancient Jomon line is practically non-existent. I mean, look at that difference. It is night and day.
So, what's the verdict? It's completely unambiguous. The DNA evidence just demolishes the old theory that some conquering army of horse riders swept in from the continent and took over. It just didn't happen. If it had, Japan's paternal DNA would look a lot like Korea's, and it absolutely doesn't. The ancient father lines of the Jomon people survived. They didn't just survive, they thrived.
And this is where the science gets truly poetic, because it lines up perfectly with Japan's oldest legends. The foundational myths in the Kojiki speak of two kinds of gods, the heavenly gods who descended from the sky and the earthly gods who were already there ruling the land. And the story isn't about one group destroying the other. It's about negotiation, compromise, and eventually union. It's really possible that this ancient myth is actually a cultural memory, a story about two very real groups of people, the newcomers, the Yayoi, and the original inhabitants, the Jomon, figuring out how to become one nation.
So in the end, the story of the Japanese people isn't one of replacement or conquest, but one of mixing and coming together. It's a story that was written chapter by chapter in their DNA. And it's an amazing reminder that every single one of us is carrying an epic history inside ourselves, a story that connects us all to this incredible shared human journey. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What stories are waiting to be read inside your DNA?